chest, on our rights. Hey, hey. The heart of a man, the way of this land. Injustice for all was never the plan. Nah, it's never the plan. Justice beats for the two that part. Justice beats. Let's talk smart. Justice beats for the two that part. Justice beats. Let's talk smart.
All right, welcome in everybody. Happy March. This is Justice Beat Season 8, Episode 3. Today we're going to be talking about the nutrition in prison systems with our wonderful guest, Daniel Rosen. Rachel will be interviewing our guest this morning. As always, if anybody has any questions, feel free to just drop them in the chat of whatever platform you're using, and we will get to them towards the end of the show. But other than that, Rachel, you could take it away.
Perfect. So like Jules was saying, we're so excited to have you on today. And just jumping right in, you have done a myriad of things related and not related directly to the nutrition in prisons. But before co-founding your current organization, we're going to talk about Coalition for Carceral Nutrition. You also worked with advocacy groups like Worth Rises, in addition to about 20 years in public service. And you have the unique perspective of being incarcerated yourself. Would you be able to first start by sharing about your experience in the prison system and how that has kind of influenced your involvement with just the prison systems in general, and then also with Coalition for Carceral Nutrition?
Yeah, and thanks for having me. Happy March also. I appreciate being here. I think I use the word unique, and sadly, one thing that brings up for me is how ununique that experience of incarceration is. Something like 80 million people in this country have the experience of being involved in the justice system somehow. And that is a big, big number. The number of people who have spent time in state prisons is obviously smaller than that, but a lot of people have experienced our carceral system in one way or another, even if it's just being booked into a night in jail. So I think when it comes to this issue about food and nutrition in jails and prisons, I have been home from spending about 6 years incarcerated. I've been home for about 3 years now. And I think I have worked on a number of issues from an advocacy standpoint. But for me, this issue has come up because of my own experience. Before I was incarcerated, I had a kind of a health scare back about 10, 15 years ago, and really started paying attention to my health, to my nutrition, to what I was eating, to how the food that I was eating, how my nutrition affected my health. And, started to realize I think some of the connections that are, even now, today, people are starting to, I think, tune into a little bit more. And for me, I really changed, not everything. I'm not kind of like a health nut. I eat cookies, I eat ice cream, but I think I just started paying attention to what I was putting in my body and how it affected my overall health. And then I went to prison, jail first and then prison. And understood that the way we were feeding people inside also was affecting their health and well-being, and affecting 95% of people who are going to prison are coming back to our society. They're going to be our neighbors. They are our neighbors, and we are feeding them in ways that deteriorates their health, that I think hurts communities, hurts families, and costs us all money in the long run when it comes to people's health and wellness. So for me, this issue was very personal in terms of how I came to it when I was in prison. And I don't want to spend the whole hour telling you stories, I guess, but it was clear to me that feeding people was an exercise in checking the box. Jails and prisons tend to care about security first and foremost, over and above anything else. How people are fed is not really on the minds, I think, of many jail and prison administrators. That they are fed at all is, of course, their responsibility, but feeding people tends to be an exercise, I think, in checking the box. And when we feed people that way, without regard to their health and their wellness, either physical or emotional, we're doing damage. And I think that's something that, for me, just is not easy to ignore. A lot of people have said to me, why food and nutrition? Why is this the issue you want to focus on? I usually say to them, tell me you've never been incarcerated without telling me you've never been incarcerated. Yeah. People out here in the world care what they eat. We have conversations with our loved ones, with our families every day about what's for dinner. And to think that people inside wouldn't have the same questions and concerns about what they're eating, I think it's foolish. We are people's dignity, I think, is wrapped up in how they're fed, how they're treated inside, and we ignore that, I think, at our peril.
So I know you just spoke a little bit about your experience. Thank you, by the way, for sharing that. And kind of the idea that in, these prison systems, incarceration, nutrition is not prioritized. And I know you said a little bit about this, but can you explain maybe a little bit more on how that nutrition system works within the prison systems and some of the main challenges that, are in with providing balanced meals to incarcerated individuals?
Yeah, I think it's always important to start with the why, right? Like, why does this issue matter? And it matters to people's health. It matters to people's dignity. It matters to, I think, what all of us pay in healthcare costs because people come home sicker. I think we should be feeding people in ways that heal, not harm them, right? But I think the what is important here because many people just don't understand what that looks like inside. And the what, we have 50 state prison systems. We have about 3,500 county jails in this country. We have a federal system. We have immigration detention. We have youth detention. And every one of those systems tends to feed people the way it wants to feed people. There is very little that's uniform about the way people are fed in jails and prisons across this country. Sheriffs run county jails the way they want to. State prisons tend to have some more rules and regulations around how people are fed, but not a lot. I compare that to kind of like federal school lunch programs, right? School lunches are, if you go look at the regulations and the the rules around federal school lunch, you'll see an extensive set of regulations around what kids must be fed, what standards it must meet. Go look for a federal standard on feeding people who are incarcerated. It doesn't exist. And that's, to my mind, a problem. So what this tends to look like in most places, some facilities have what's called a chow hall or a dining room. Some facilities tend to feed people either on their cell block or in their cells. So that's one kind of division. State prisons tend to have dining halls or chow halls more often than jails or local facilities do. People are served a tray generally 3 times a day, and breakfast, lunch, and dinner tend to be at very strange hours. Breakfast can come as early as 4:30 in the morning in a lot of facilities. Lunch can often come at 10 o'clock, dinner at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. And I think it's something a lot of people don't realize. People are hungry by the end of the day. By 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night, people are hungry. Jails and prisons tend to feed people in all the ways that we know are wrong and bad for people's health. If you look at the dietary guidelines for Americans or other kind of nutrition standards, jails and prisons are kind of feeding people in exactly the opposite way. They tend to include a lot of starchy meals, empty calories, things that fill people up without providing a lot of nutrients. So the level of protein is low, the level of fiber is low, complex carbohydrates is low, and fruits and vegetables, above all, is usually very low. We just did an analysis of DC jails menus as against the dietary guidelines, which recommend 2.5 cups of fruits and vegetables a day. And folks there are getting about 1/3 of that. So jails and prisons will often tell you that they meet some standard. They'll tell you that their menus are signed off on by a registered dietitian. They'll tell you that their food service meets American Correctional Association standards. They'll tell you that it meets the National Commission on Correctional Healthcare standards. But those standards tend to be fairly inadequate, minimal, I guess. ACA standards tend to have more to do with food safety than they do with nutritional quality. So food service administrators spend a lot of time on food safety. It's an important issue, and I don't want to minimize that. One survey of folks in the DC jail, which tracks with national surveys, says that folks there had been served spoiled or rotten food. 70% of the folks there had been served spoiled or rotten food. We have listeria outbreaks in state prisons, and 250 people at a time will get sick. It's an issue when prisons have 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people in them. Foodborne illnesses like that can spread very quickly and affect large numbers of people. So I don't want to minimize food safety, but nutritional quality tends to be a different thing. And when dietitians sign off on menus, they're really not signing off that the menus are nutritionally adequate. They're signing off that the menu meets state standards for carceral nutrition, and that's a very different thing. It's essentially a circular argument that, yep, this menu meets, what the state has said, which is often very little. So, we have meals that are unhealthy, not unnutritious. They may meet some basic standards when it comes to sodium or when it comes to sugar content, but they typically are so unnutritious in the ways that we know harm people's long-term health, leading to diabetes, leading to obesity, heart disease, leading to high blood pressure. High blood pressure is an interesting one too, because a lot of the high sodium foods can come from commissary, and I think we can't leave what's known as commissary foods out of this argument. Commissary is kind of the prison store that people turn to if they are not getting the kind of food and nutrition that they need from the institution's food service. So every jail or prison has a commissary. The items tend to be all highly processed packaged foods. They all have to be shelf-stable foods, never any kind of fresh foods for sale, really, in prison commissaries or jail commissaries. And they tend to be very expensive, which means we're putting a financial burden on people and their families. People incarcerated don't earn much money, if any. In some states, they don't earn any money at all. But even in the states where they earn money, it's not enough to pay for any kind of food in the commissary. It's usually barely enough to meet people's hygiene needs, what they get paid. So people turn to commissary foods, very high in sodium usually. Packages of ramen tend to be a staple commissary food in most places because they're cheap. They're cheapest. And packages of ramen have inordinate amounts of sodium in them. And especially if you eat a couple packages at a time, as I've seen a lot of people do. So those kinds of foods that people turn to when institutional food service is bad. Institutional food service, often what I saw in my time incarcerated, people would go to the chow hall or a tray would show up and you'd take one thing off of it. Maybe there was a piece of cake. Maybe there was something that was edible on a tray and you just dump the rest. And so, I can't even count how many times, you just see towering stacks of full trays, sitting in the dining hall that somebody took one item off of and left the rest of it there. So we're also wasting a lot of food. The environmental waste implications of that, I think, are huge and kind of unexplored. But I think we're also, as taxpayers, wasting a lot of money with correctional food service, some of which is heavily privatized, right? As far as anyone can tell, about probably half the states privatize their food service. Missouri being one of them. Missouri contracted out its food service to Aramark a couple years ago, and with pretty bad results. So we're spending a lot of money as taxpayers, millions and millions of dollars a year feeding people, only to have most of the food thrown out at the end of the day. Our surveys say that, half to 2/3 of the food is sometimes thrown away just because it's unpalatable, inedible. That kind of food waste, I think should bother all of us. So I don't know if that's, I don't want to go too deep at this point in the conversation about the kind of the what of what's being served in our jails and prisons. But it tends to be low quality, low grade, low nutrition foods that check the box and say, we've fed people today. And that's about it.
Yeah, no, that was all extremely helpful. I do have a question, just kind of in addition to what you were saying. So you're talking about how a lot of these foods we see, or we're hearing about in the prison and jail systems are not nutritious and they're starchy or processed in the chow halls and in commissary. Would you say these are generally foods that don't cost as much for the prison and jail systems to provide? Or is it, because I know there's a financial component of it too?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that in. I think the financial component is a big part of this equation. They are fed. I think people incarcerated are fed what tend to be the cheapest possible foods. So highly processed foods tend to be cheapest. Starchy foods tend to be cheapest. Even with vegetables, you see most prisons and jails serving starchy vegetables of the kind that are really the cheapest. Potatoes, corn, those kinds of things. Cost is a big factor. And it's, it varies quite a lot around the country, but the typical average jail or prison spends about $250 a day, I think, feeding people. $250 a day means about 75 cents a meal, which I'd challenge anybody in your audience to try to feed themselves or their family for 75 cents per meal. it's just not possible to feed people healthy when you're spending that kind of money. And so, when we look at solutions, I think what we're spending on meals for people incarcerated has to be part of the equation. There are some places that feed people as low as $1.50 a day. And there are some places like Missouri, I think the figure I saw was about $5 a day. It's hard to know sometimes I don't think there's any standard for really solid comparison. What Missouri may be including in that $5 a day may not be the same thing that other facilities are including in their cost estimates. The DC jail will tell you that it spends $2.50 per meal to feed people. But we know very little of that is ending up on the food tray, right? A lot of that is going to the food service contractor, to staff salaries. So when you include things like staff salaries, we're not really talking about what we're spending on feeding people. We're talking about the whole food service contract or the food service, production, and not really what we're spending to feed people. The average American spends something like $11 a day to feed themselves. So roughly 4 times the average of what we're spending on people incarcerated. And that's not even counting going out. So that's really just kind of groceries. If you add going out, I think the figure is somewhere around $20 a day that people spend on food. We are, I think, we're a problem if we're going to spend 75 cents a meal and think that that's what people are worth who are incarcerated. The other part of that equation, like, this math just doesn't math, right? Like, prison systems are spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year on healthcare. And we know that diet-related disease drives a lot of those costs.
Right.
The incidence of diabetes, of heart disease, of obesity, of high blood pressure in prisons, we don't get good reporting on this because prison systems don't tend to want to collect that kind of information. But we know the incidence, say, of diabetes is roughly something like twice the level of the general population outside of prisons. From the few studies that have been done, and that is costing us a great deal on the back end. Whether their healthcare is being provided for in prison or by public assistance systems, by Medicaid, for instance, or Medicare when they come home. We're spending a lot of money on the back end for the way people are being fed on the front end.
Yes, I did not know a lot of that, so that was really insightful. And the comparison of like $20 to like 75 cents is, that's big. So in terms of your organization that you have co-founded, Coalition for Carceral Nutrition, can you talk just a little bit about that to the viewers, what it kind of is in general and what your impact has been in the mission and everything?
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. I think our myself and my partner, co-founder partner, who's in New York and was formerly incarcerated as well, I think have been talking about this for quite some time, but look kind of at the landscape of who's working in this space and what efforts there are to reform the space, and just didn't see very much. There are pockets of good activity going on all over, at the state level, at the national level, but there's not really a larger conversation around how we're taking care of people incarcerated, especially when it comes to food and nutrition. Even the conversations that I do see around conditions of confinement don't tend to really focus on this issue at all. And I think that's a mistake. So we saw a gap. We saw, some good work done in this area, but not really any connective tissue, any organizations working to focus. There's a couple of notable exceptions, I think. Impact Justice, I think for any of your viewers who are interested, should be required reading a a report that they put out a few years back on the hidden punishment of prison food. And I think they are probably, leading in this area for sure. Food Behind Bars in the UK is working on this issue. So there are a couple of organizations that have been focused on this issue, but I think there's not enough happening in this space. To me, we will never, I think, and this comes back to kind of the why. If we want to give people a chance at re-entering society successfully, we can't strip away their dignity and agency and then expect them to come home better. We can't expect better neighbors and better community members if we're taking away all of their dignity by feeding them badly, among other things, by feeding them in ways that harm them, among other things, and then expect them to return and be productive in society. We can't, you and I out here in the world have all the choice we want when it comes to food, all the choice we can afford anyway, when it comes to food. There is none of that inside. You are handed a tray and said, here's what you're eating. If you can afford it, if you don't like it and you can afford it, I guess go to commissary and you can eat badly there too. So I think for us, there's a lot on our plate, and our mission is really put simply to change the tray of what I'm interested in passing laws. I'm interested in changing the way we do procurement and the way prisons and jails contract with food service providers. But at the end of the day, it has to change what shows up on trays in front of people 3 times a day. Because right now, I think when people are handed a tray 3 times a day, they are being told effectively that the state or the county or the people do not care about them. And I think what that tray that people are handed has to change. So I think we want to, for sure, raise awareness around this issue, change the conversation and the narrative around this issue. Importantly, I think there is not a lot of public give a damn for what people eat and who are incarcerated. But I think, explicitly, we have to change that conversation, that narrative around why that matters. So that's one piece. I think there is an information sharing and coalition building piece where we have to lift up the good work that is going on around the country. And then there's the piece of, working with facilities and institutions to not only change their menus. Changing paper menus doesn't interest me a whole lot. I mean, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Anybody who's incarcerated can tell you that what's posted on the menu, and menus are often posted, does not often reflect the reality of what shows up on trays. So we want to, I think, work with the facilities that are a little bit more open-minded and a little bit more thoughtful about this issue to change what they are serving people on a day-to-day basis, and find more nutritious alternatives at a cost that can be afforded.
Yes, and the piece of kind of making the food itself and how the person who's receiving it feels as far as their worth, I think is an important piece too when we think about like food as fuel and all these other things that many people probably don't consider. With that being said, sorry.
I was just gonna say, there's a whole national conversation going on around food as medicine,
Right.
food as health, and that tends to ignore, I think, institutional food service broadly.
Right.
It's a very kind of patient-centered, individual-centered model, but especially, to the extent that it involves institutions, I think there's some focus on schools, maybe a little bit on hospitals, almost none on carceral facilities.
Yes. And speaking of health, we are going to jump into that in a moment. I believe you're taking a quick commercial break, and then we will be back to talk about the health effects.
Thanks. Great.
Introducing Next Generation Media Internship Program, designed for undergraduates, postgraduates, unemployed, dislocated workers, and WIOA participants. Our program offers remote virtual work experiences, qualifying as approved individualized career services. Learn while leading at your own pace, with part-time or full-time hours per week. Benefit from weekly debriefings and group supervision, along with our 15-minute masterclasses. Our projects include the Justice Beat Talk Show and the Just Us Youth Talk Show.
All right. So we have established here that food in prison and jail systems is not nutritionally adequate, and there is a lot of potential to change that. And you were talking a bit about health issues like obesity, blood pressure, diabetes that we're seeing in a lot of incarcerated individuals. Is this something, I know you were talking about long term, but more specifically, it's kind of like a two-parter question. Is this something that we're generally seeing people having pre-existing conditions and the prison and jail systems worsening that, or they develop within the jails and prisons, and then once they're out, they continue those eating habits, or is it a combination? That makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it is a combination.
Okay.
We definitely tend to see people coming into jails and prisons, and jails especially. Let's talk about that for a sec, because that's at the front end of the system, right? People always are going to pass through a jail before they end up in a state prison. I think almost entirely. And the incidence of people coming into jails with probably diet-related diseases, among other types of medical issues, with unhealthy eating habits, with also mild or severe mental health issues, mild or severe addiction and substance use issues, and all many other forms of trauma. And I think what we're doing by the way we're feeding people is exacerbating those conditions that in many cases do already exist. We're certainly not in most cases giving folks the nutrition education that might help with that situation. I mean, there are some places where there are some innovative nutrition education programs going on, but it's not widespread in any way. And then there are the cases, I think, that you mentioned also, where folks who are incarcerated are developing those problems that they didn't have, especially in prisons where they tend to be longer. But even in jails, it does not take a long time to become pre-diabetic if you're fed the way people are fed in jails around this country. I heard the director of a corrections agency the other day say, well, people are only in our jails for an average of something like 275 days. 275 days is beyond long enough to develop diet-related disease problems. A few months tends to be long enough. I don't know if folks who are watching this show will remember Morgan Spurlock, who just died, and his 30-day experiment eating McDonald's every day.
I didn't even know about that.
And I think it was called Supersize Me.
Oh, okay.
And it does not take long to develop diet-related disease conditions, or at least preconditions for diabetes and other diseases. And so when we're talking about folks who are incarcerated, often for long, long sentences in this country, 10, 20, 30, 50 years, for sure we have people coming into the system who exit with problems they didn't have when they came in, and so we're dealing with both.
And I think as you were kind of talking about the idea that it doesn't take long to form these related health issues, makes me think of that one uh, phrase. I don't know exactly, but it's like, oh, it takes 21 days to form a habit. I don't know if that's relevant with like eating habits and everything, but it just made me think of that and um, how that kind of presents, to the people who are incarcerated when you're not receiving like a good quality meal and stuff, and just questioning like, is this what I'm worth, being fed? And then like, how that kind of translates to how that what kind of change will be seen like re-release, like, oh, am I worthy of like doing better? And that kind of relates to those mental health effects that you were talking about, I think, which is important to consider as well.
Yeah, I think we can't ignore the role of trauma here. People who come into our jails tend to be in a highly stressed situation, personal situation, and then we're putting them into a highly stressful environment, an environment that's loud, that's often unsafe, that's where they have potentially likely a court case and incarceration hanging over their head. And and then we're going to feed people in all the ways that are not going to help with any of that trauma.
Right.
We're going to feed them badly. And, I remember during my time in jail and the folks, people fighting that kind of trauma and dealing with that kind of trauma often aren't necessarily going to turn to the healthiest food alternatives. When I'm stressed out, even now, I probably head for the ice cream before I head for the fruit.
Yeah.
That's understandable. But I think we have to balance this when we look at, then, how people are going to be fed on a day-to-day basis, even understanding that stress and that trauma. When we look at how people are going to be fed on a day-to-day basis and what the institution's responsibility is. If people experiencing that kind of stress can afford it and want to buy cookies from the commissary, I'm not going to tell them they shouldn't.
Right.
But the way the institution's feeding people is a different thing. And I think, I've heard institutional administrators say, well, people just want pizza. People want bacon cheeseburgers. Of course they do. Especially in a jail environment. They're stressed out. I think most of us like what we'd consider junk food to some degree. But that's not to say that that's the institution's responsibility for how it feeds people, especially when they're feeding people with taxpayer money, right? And causing, even if, I guess what I'm trying to say is, even if you don't care about the human dignity aspect of this, about the choice or agency aspect of this problem, I think your viewers ought to care about the financial implications and the taxpayer implications of this problem, because we're feeding people in ways that cost us all money in the long run, and a lot of money. Healthcare costs tend to be one of the biggest costs for any prison system, and one of the biggest costs in any state budget. In Virginia, where I was incarcerated, healthcare costs eat up roughly a quarter of the budget. Staffing eats up roughly half the budget, but healthcare eats up about a quarter of the budget. And that's in prison. So that's not even to talk about what happens when people come home and then rely on public assistance or Medicaid for their healthcare needs. And we're costing ourselves a lot of money by the way we're feeding people, even if you don't care about how people feel about themselves. And you ought to, your viewers ought to, because it affects how they're going to react when they come home, how they're going to integrate back into society when they come home. We ignore that. and not just about food and nutrition. We tend to ignore that. You know, I'm wearing this shirt today about recidivism, not about food. We tend to set people up for failure when it comes to how they, how they come home and how they reenter society. We know that people's housing, people's jobs, and people's health are the three things that really affect their reentry back into society. Probably in that order.
And sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and I don't know what, what's more important to health really than nutrition. There's nothing. And so we expect them to reenter successfully, but we're not giving people the tools to do that.
So when you were talking about healthcare costs being one of the biggest kind of costs we see in the long run, I know one of the biggest kind of concerns or problems that people, try and use is that there is the financial component. There are constraints that would be able to serve adequate food is just not possible, or something along the lines of that. I know you were talking about this a bit earlier, how like the math isn't mathing. Is there with the money that we see going into the prison and jail systems, into like taxpayer dollars and everything, is it being disproportionately kind of distributed with the like staffing, salaries, and such in terms of the food? Like, is there a way to change it that's reasonable, you'd say, and why this is, such a huge problem then as well? Because it's just not being redistributed.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's kind of I would love to talk about the kind of the human dignity issues, the nutrition issues, but the budget issues here are real. And I would say, and including that, the budget and procurement issues here are real. How contracts are written for food service matter. Feeding people well is not going to be cheap, right? I mean, it's just, we have to spend a little bit more money if we're going to feed people in ways that are appropriate to their health, appropriate to their dignity, but also appropriate to their health. One of the things I think we see as a barrier is, frankly, contracting food service out to companies that are not necessarily interested. They're interested in their bottom line. They're not interested in people's health, wellness, and dignity. So Aramark Correctional Services is the biggest player in that space. There are a couple of the smaller companies that tend to have like single-digit market share. Trinity, Summit. Those are companies that tend to work only in correctional spaces. I think we should always be skeptical of companies that are only working in correctional spaces. Healthcare companies, phone companies, food service companies. They tend to only work in those spaces because there is a lot less scrutiny on their delivery of services in those settings. And their delivery of services is usually pretty subpar and wouldn't fly in most markets. So Aramark Correctional Service is a little bit different. They, as far as we can tell, own roughly a third of the prison food service market in state prisons, and again, the math is difficult sometimes because we don't know what's being included in some of these costs, but we have a sense that it's not particularly cheaper to contract out food service to some of these private companies. And what it tends to also do then is become a barrier to change in that health and nutrition space.
Right.
When food service, among other things, is contracted, the prison administrators can say, well, it's the contractor, they're the ones responsible. And the contractor can say, well, we're just doing things according to the contract that we were awarded. And I think the costs are one of those things, and the personnel costs especially are one of those things. I spend a lot of time dealing with this issue in DC here and with the DC Department of Corrections in the jail here. There are a couple of handfuls of jail residents that work in the kitchen, and there are dozens and dozens of Aramark contractors that work in that kitchen. So we're spending a lot of money on personnel. In DC's case, we spend about $7 million a year feeding people through the Aramark contract in our jail. Most of that money is going to salaries or contractor overhead. Most of it's not ending up on the food tray. And so what we're also losing, though, in that scenario where food service is contracted out is the ability for residents of jails and prisons to gain valuable experience.
Mm-hmm.
Prison and jail kitchens don't tend to work like a lot of restaurant kitchens. They're feeding people on a much different scale. They're feeding, some thousands of meals a day.
Right.
But institutional food service can be a valuable workforce training opportunity for people, unless the kitchen's filled with contractors. And so, we're wasting money, I think, when we contract out food service. We tend to have worse nutrition outcomes when we contract out food service. And we're losing an opportunity, I think, to give people some valuable job skills training. We say, like, food should be a source of not just dignity, but opportunity. And that opportunity, I think, often is being lost in the way that we're feeding people and the way that we're running institutional food service in a lot of corrections agencies.
Right. And kind of going along with that, theme of like dignity and opportunity, and looking less at as budget and financial aspect is a big component, kind of going back to this human dignity portion of it, and thinking about the different cultural aspects and religious aspects. And as you said, there's millions of people who do have this experience. There's a lot of people that are coming into contact with jails and prisons, and this is their reality. Are there any accommodations for individuals with either specific dietary needs or restrictions, and medical needs, or when we're thinking about religious practices, in providing culturally appropriate meals?
Yeah, I think there's the issue of nutrition, and then there's the issue kind of food sovereignty and people's ability to have some choice in what they eat. And I think religious choice is an important element that we tend to do in jails and prisons pretty badly on. There are religious meals available in, I think, virtually every jail and prison across the country. There are medical meals, that are ordered through the medical department for the most part. A doctor needs to sign off on them. But they don't look much like what you and I would recognize as religiously or medically appropriate meals. They tend to be some variation of what's served to the general population, because it cuts down on costs. And I think one of the things I saw for sure was that a lot of grievances about food tend to be about medical or religious meals, and whether they're provided at all or the way in which they're provided. Ramadan is it's upon us, and it's one of those times when I think prison populations tend to have a pretty high number of Muslim residents, and Ramadan tends to be one of those times when prisons are, especially, feeding people according to religious guidelines or religious restrictions, and doing it pretty badly most of the time. Medical meals are a whole nother situation. I think every every jail or prison has medical meals for diabetics, for folks with high blood pressure, for people with all sorts of medical conditions. And those meals look nothing like what we would consider medically appropriate or medically tailored diet interventions on the outside. They wouldn't pass the laugh test for most agencies out here in the world that are providing medically appropriate meals. Medically tailored meals are like a thing now, right? I mean, if you can in some places get a prescription for medically tailored meals for all sorts of dietary conditions. And what we're providing to folks who have those kinds of conditions on the inside, I think we wouldn't even recognize here on the outside as appropriate to those medical conditions. And that's a big problem.
And as you're saying all of this, it also kind of comes up in my mind that, especially when you're younger too, and you're going to your doctor or whoever it is, and so much of, what they say is often like, are you getting the adequate amount of fruits and vegetables a day? And like, what are you eating and putting into your body? And so kind of I don't know if like, hypocrite is the right word, but like the ironicness of it then within these prison and jail systems is you're, trying to not have, when we're thinking about recidivism, we're asking these people like, do better, but you're not giving them, a lot of the tools required that would help them be better.
And, I think you'll see us almost never use the word correctional when it comes to correctional food service. We use the term carceral for a reason. Correctional agencies, quote unquote, don't correct much. And in fact, speaking of carceral, I'll encourage your viewers to check out carceralnutrition.org. Carceralnutrition.org is where you can sign up for updates from us. I think we're a young organization. We're still just getting started, but we are trying to at least improve the dialogue and the conversation around this issue. I don't think we'll change the tray really until we change the conversation around the tray. And I think that part probably has to come first. We have a lot of work to do in this space. I think we can do better on procurement. We can use values-based procurement models. We can do better on not contracting out a lot of these food service operations and going back to cooking from scratch in a lot of places. Food service has worsened significantly over the last 30 years as we have kind of ultra processed and gone away from just cooking from scratch in most facilities. The centralization of food service, even where it's not contracted, most states have just centralized everything into a big food processing warehouse. And everything is kind of, processed and packaged and sent out to the institutions. And those models, I think, are never going to result in people eating healthy.
So then from kind of, I guess, a tactical standpoint in changing the conversation, does this start at a state level, or is it like you get legal representatives involved, or is it, I know it's probably very complicated, but
lawsuits I think are always a good way to change what states are kind of forced to do, but lawsuits are problematic for a whole host of reasons I won't get into. Lawsuits about conditions of confinement don't tend to go very far. So I think, there's certainly an advocacy piece at the state level. There has to be, I think, a national conversation about what federal rules there are around this, but there also has to be state conversations around how because each state is doing it as it sees fit. And so we have to work at a state level with the organizations in those states that are, focused on, at least the ones that are focused on conditions of confinement, even if they're not focused solely on food, to change this conversation and dynamic around this issue.
Speaking of conversations, ours is sadly coming to an end in a couple minutes here. But do you have anything in terms of your current work with your organization or personally, or just anything you want to leave the viewers with, any, any just last pieces.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I will encourage folks to check out carceralnutrition.org. I will, we have some resources there. I think one of the good resources that I've started to collect is just state level reports, like we were just talking about, where states do have oversight agencies, either state level or outside organizations that have looked at food service and looked at conditions. And I think those state level reports are the foundation for a lot of potential work around changing laws, changing regulations, and even below that level of just working with corrections agencies. Maine is doing some good work in this area. I don't want to oversell it, but Maine has started to do. I think they have a corrections commissioner that has recognized a gentleman named Randall Liberty, who has recognized the importance of this issue to the overall health and wellness of not just people, but overall, running of his facilities. And he recognizes that his facilities are safer and more secure for everybody. The residents, the people that work there, when people are not hangry, when people are fed, decently, when people have some level of agency around their food choices. And it's working. His incidents, security incidents in his facilities are down quite a lot since they started this and a whole host of other reforms. I don't want to attribute that solely to food, but that's one of the reforms that they've made that I think is working. And other states, I think are learning from that model. Maine is pretty good about talking to their counterparts and other corrections agencies. So I would encourage, if nothing else, anybody in corrections listening to this, to look at what's going on in Maine. There's a couple other California is doing some interesting stuff. There's a couple places where this issue at least has gotten some attention and where some reforms are being made. And we're trying to highlight those too, not just the places that are doing it badly.
Yes. Thank you for the additional information and for being on the show today and bringing all of the professional, but I think more importantly, a lot of personal experience that has motivated you to kind of combat this very real and very important issue.
Yeah, thanks so much for the questions and for being here. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for watching. We will see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Justice Beat. If you like what you heard and found the information useful, then support the Justice Beat Radio